In this lecture, we're going to talk about GitHub Codespaces in the context of how we'll use them for PGE383 high performance computing. This is not a lecture on advanced configuration or creation of Codespaces and their related containers or the front end options. So as we'll see in a minute, you can launch a GitHub Codespace to be attached to a web-based VS Code front end or a Jupyter Lab front end. And we're not going to talk about any of the customizations of either of those editors at the moment. We're just going to talk about how to launch Codespaces and navigate through the basic operations from the web browser. So what Codespaces are virtual machines with a set of instructions that define the exact package environment to be installed. Those instructions are contained in this dev container folder, and again, the details of that we're not going to discuss in this lecture. But basically, this enables a developer to define an exact environment which they would prefer to be recreated every time they go to edit this code. So if you're familiar with GitHub and interacting with GitHub, you've probably interacted with it locally by clicking on the code button and over on this local tab, copying this URL, which you then paste to your command line and clone the repository locally. However, what we're going to do is on the right, we're going to click on Codespaces. Again, if Codespaces are enabled for your environment, you'll see this. For your repository, you'll see this. And the first time, if you've never created a Codespace before for a certain repository, you only have one option, and that is to create it. It does take a few minutes the first time to configure and set up. After the first time, all your settings are cached and the code space is stored for 30 days, at least 30 days of inactivity. So as long as you're using it, it will always remain there for at least 30 days after that. Of course, you can always save your changes to GitHub, and those changes will be held, essentially without limit, but your code space will be there for 30 days in the way that you left it. So we'll just give this a few more minutes to set up, and we'll talk about what we have here. Okay, so our code space has been launched and configured, and what we're looking at is a web-based version of VS Code. VS Code is a popular, probably at the time of this recording, the most popular code editor, particularly for data science and other coding operations. So this is just VS Code running in a browser, and depending on exactly on your configuration and setup, you may have different windows open by default. In this case, I have a terminal window open down here. This pane up at the top is for files that will be opened. The left pane over here is the file browser, which can be toggled with this button up here. So you can see that when the code space opens, it already opens with our repository loaded and ready for editing. So for example, we could open the test.py file. This is a Python file that runs the unit test for this assignment. And since it's a Python file, we could actually go ahead and run it by hitting this play button up here. Now, this assignment hasn't been attempted or completed, so the tests are going to fail. On the first instantiation, it loads a new terminal window, but if I hit play again, it will run the tests, and you can see they fail. Of course, this is a terminal window down here, so I could also just type python test.py and also run that file to see that the files that the test have failed. Can also open up windows and access other commands by toggling this little window by typing Control P. You see that window at the top opens. On a Mac, that would be Command P. By default, it opens into a place that is for interactive file search, so I can just begin to type the name of a file I'd like to open, like for example, read. And you see it automatically highlights the README file, which I can then open. So now I have two files open at the top, which I can click between them, tab between them. I can also, change their view, placing them next to each other or on top of one another. I can close out the terminal. I could put them in a view like this, where they're one on top of one another, and I can then put it back into its original view as well. Along with hitting Control P, again by default it opens the interactive file search, but if I type the greater than symbol, then I get access to many of the settings and other commands. So for example, if I wanted to say view the settings file, I can type settings, and then what I'm looking for is preferences, open user settings, and this opens a bunch of customizations that can be synced across all instances of VS Code and other things. Again, we'll talk about more about that later. But basically, what we have here is of interest today is just access to the files in the file browser, opening files for editing. There's some other things like we can find, search and replace within a file. We have a way to interact with Git and GitHub from here. We have a debugger, which we'll talk about later, access to GitHub and other things. The next thing I want to show is that we can actually, returning to GitHub, now that we've opened this code space before, we'll see it here. They're given default names, which are often kind of silly, like this one, Effective Giggle. But now that it's open, I can go here and I can click on Open in Visual Studio Code, and now this opens a local installation of Visual Studio Code. This is meaning running on my machine. The file editor is running on my machine, but it's connected to the virtual machine, the dev container in the cloud. So I can still access all of the things I could do previously, except now it may be a little snappier because I'm not going through a browser. I'm working here on my local machine. So I'm just going to close out of that. And finally, the last thing we can do is we can actually open this in Jupyter Lab. So if you're familiar with Jupyter, Jupyter Hub, Jupyter Projects, you can actually open this in Jupyter Lab, which is a common data science platform. That we see here. And again, we have all the same files. It's open in the repository, so we can open, for example, the Python test file and work on it that way. So this should give you an idea of how to interact or open GitHub Codespaces from GitHub in whatever preference you prefer, either Jupyter Lab, locally using a local installation of VS Code, or in the browser.